Hello, friends. Welcome to Peace and Power Ukraine, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history, where East meets West and freedom collides with totalitarianism. I am so excited to have you join us today. We have unpredictable times really happening all around us. Today, this week, really, we're going to wonder whether Ukraine will begin to have new leverage thanks to U.S. intelligence cooperation to launch new offensive opportunities. And we wonder if President Trump really understands the impact of potential Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia. As always, I hope to bring more light than heat as we dig a little deeper with guests from really across the public policy spectrum. I am today so excited to bring to you, my audience, John Lenczowski, who is founder, president emeritus, and chancellor of the Institute of World Politics, an independent graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs in Washington, D.C. IWP is dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of international realities and ethical conduct of statecraft, based on knowledge and appreciation of American founding principles and the Western moral tradition. I've so been looking forward to having this conversation, John. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'm honored to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. Well, before we go into diplomatic this and headlines that, really tell me about the Institute for World Politics for our audience that might not be familiar with it.
Well, I used to serve in government in the Reagan administration. I was in the State Department for a couple of years, and I was the President's Soviet Affairs Advisor for 4 years at the National Security Council in the White House. And I found a lot of people were doing jobs for which they weren't completely prepared. And in spite of having a double major from Berkeley and a PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, I was one of those who was not fully prepared to do my jobs. And so I had been teaching at Georgetown University, moonlighting while I was in the government, and I tried to get Georgetown to fill the gaps in the curriculum, to get, particularly in the study of the different arts of statecraft, the instruments of national power, military strategy, diplomacy, public diplomacy, strategic influence, political warfare, intelligence, counterintelligence, economic strategy, etc. And how we liken, these are like instruments in an orchestra. And you have to learn to play your instrument well, but you also have to be an integrated strategic thinker so that you realize you're part of an orchestra and you don't work at cross purposes with the others. And so Georgetown, my program director there, thought that he loved the idea, but he's told me I would have an academic turf war if I tried to set this up within the university. So I decided I didn't want a turf war, and I started an independent graduate school. And everybody said, well, why don't you go do this with some other university? And I said, well, these universities have deteriorated. They're extremely partisan. They're extremely ideological, and they wouldn't be friendly to the study of things like counterintelligence and, the different elements of intelligence, for example. Covert action. One should learn something about that if you're going to go into that profession. And so we got going independently. It was a long, long march to get independent accreditation, but our faculty are almost all scholar practitioners. We have intelligence officers, we have military officers, we have ambassadors, we have presidential advisors, former senior Capitol Hill staffers, people who've actually done what they teach. And so we offered the first degree in strategic intelligence, for example, if any university.
And what year was that?
Probably in the early 2000s. It's hard to say, maybe 2004, something like that. We offered the first professional doctoral program in national security, something that would prepare practitioners rather than simply academics. We have a PhD program too. We have 7 master's programs. We have 3 doctoral programs. They're both in line and on person. And we we pay very close attention to the study of American founding principles, because I don't think you can defend a country and a civilization that you neither understand and perhaps that you don't love. And so if one, there's been such a precipitous decline in the study of civics and in American political philosophy that that people don't understand this country and the genius behind our constitutional arrangements. In some respects, I don't think you can be an American unless you've read the Federalist Papers and are familiar with what the Anti-Federalists had to say, who gave us the Bill of Rights. I mean, these are majestic arguments and a majestic set of constitutional arrangements. And yet so many Americans grow up, they take it all for granted. And now the professoriate is teaching them to hate their country and hate their parents too.
Right. So really, in order to do the practicality and difficult work of statecraft, you have to build it on a foundation of those founding principles and love of America. So how many graduates are we talking about now in the last 20 years for your program?
It's been 35 years now that we've been in business, and we've sent out about 2,000 graduates. We have right now probably we fluctuate between 170 and 190 graduate students. And we're putting them, into the permanent government. We place 97% of our graduates in jobs of their, that they would like to have, that are of their preference within a year of graduation. And our federal student loan default rate is 0. And so we're having a blast.
That is great. So, John, we have listeners in our audience from obviously here in the United States, but also across Europe and in Ukraine. If there was somebody in Kyiv right now who wanted to study online with you and understand our principles of government to hopefully, continue the westward movement of Ukraine, they could absolutely do that. Is that right?
Yes.
Where would they go to find out more about your program?
They go to our website, iwp.edu. iwp.edu. And we have one of our professors, Marek Hodakiewicz, who is of Polish background, but actually originally a Ruthenian background, is one of the most productive scholars in the world on East Central Europe. And he teaches our courses on that and on Russia and on strategic geography and on Western civilization and its intellectual tradition. He's a polymath, but we have students. We do have them from around the world who want to take courses online, and compared with many other universities, we're much more affordable than others. We're a private institution. We get no government aid, but the government sends people to us. The Army, we're the only school that the Army authorized to teach strategy to the Army's Corps of Strategists.
Amazing.
We don't get them all the time because we get them when the demand for those strategists is so high that the Army War College cannot accommodate it. And so we get the spillover, but the spillover are not the dregs. These are people already working in the Pentagon and who are very glad that they don't have to uproot and move to Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Yep, that's right. That's right. My father went through the War College right there at Fort McNair. He didn't have to do the Carlisle program, but he might have been at one time a good potential target for that program. Now, John Lenczowski, you are no slouch yourself as an expert in this area. As you mentioned, in the 1980s, you served as the director of European and Soviet affairs on the National Security Council. So my question to you is, did the full-scale invasion surprise you? 3 years ago, did that come as a surprise to you, or did you feel like this was an inevitable next step for Putin's, dreams of recreating his empire?
It was no surprise at all, and given everything we know about Putin's record, and the record even a little bit before Putin, although Yeltsin was remarkably, let's say, tolerant when it came to saying, well, if a given captive nation doesn't really want to be part of Russia, they really don't have to. That's what he was saying. But already in 1992 and 93, the Russian national security doctrine's earliest drafts were making the argument that if any Russian, ethnic Russians, and maybe even they put it Russian speakers, which means just about everybody in the former Soviet Empire, are persecuted in the lands of the so-called near abroad, that Russia holds the right to intervene to defend them, which of course is something completely contrary to international law. And this violation of international law, prospective violation, was baked right into Russian national security documents from the very beginning of the post-Soviet era. In 1994, the Ukrainians started coming out. They are here. They've been independent for 3 years, maybe not quite 3, and they started complaining about Russian active measures. Now, active measures is a KGB term of art that refers to disinformation, forgeries, provocations, and covert political influence operations. And there are even more expansive definitions that include other activities, but that's a lot. And, during the Reagan administration, we were collecting intelligence on Soviet active measures. I was a member of the Soviet Active Measures Interagency Working Group. And we were collecting intelligence. We would analyze it. We would figure out the patterns and the methodologies of these active measures. We would then selectively declassify this information and then publish it and go with truth squads to share the information with the American media, with Congress, with companies, with the foreign governments and foreign media, in order to blunt the effectiveness of the deceptive and propagandistic and activities. So when the Reagan administration ended, the Bush administration basically let the whole thing die on the vine, and nobody was paying attention to it. So by 1994, the Ukrainians are complaining about Russian subversion, basically. So they're trying to soften up the battlefield, starting in 1994. And for 10 years, they did this before they invaded in 2014. And then, of course, they invaded Georgia. They did a cyber invasion of Estonia. So all of this behavior is of a piece. It's all a consistent pattern of Russian revanchism. And of course, Putin has, as we all remember, he considered that the collapse of the Soviet Empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He is a Chekist at heart, and so he wants, and he needs to do all of this partly in order to deal with his legitimacy problem, because he's fundamentally an illegitimate ruler, and he may have had some public support at the very beginning, but one wonders about this. I mean, in a rather opaque oligarchy of the kind that Russia has become, you don't really know to what extent the elections were manipulated, even in the very beginning. I suspect he had more democratic legitimacy at the beginning than he had in any subsequent election. But when you have an illegitimacy problem, you have an internal security problem. And so he first assassinated the bankers because they weren't allocating the money according to his priorities. Then he assassinated the journalists and shut them down. And then he started assassinating his political opposition. I mean, this is all a re-totalitarianization of Russia,
right?
And he has a very significant internal security system, which is the measurement of the degree to which he fears his own people.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talk about how he has public support. Well, he may have some, but we're not. I don't think there's a lot of reliable information about this.
Well, John, I've heard some dark humor in that regard. If you are a banker or an oligarch in Russia or even a journalist, you definitely want to have a first floor flat or live in a house. Otherwise, you will have an accident on your balcony.
There you go.
It's
There
almost
you go.
inevitable, and this is Putin's regime.
Yes.
So you've been tracing this for a long time, and we have a lot of younger listeners. It's important for them to hear this history because for those that don't understand the past, they're going to be doomed to repeat it. And it's vital that we walk through that, and it's vital that the next generation of practitioners understand those lessons. And I appreciate you going through that. I want to ask you about the intelligence concerns now, because you've provided those practitioners an education, and now we are making another step forward where U.S. intelligence is going to be providing Ukraine targeting information for deep within Russia to attack energy facilities. So do you view this escalation as a significant escalation, or is this just a natural next step to ratchet up the tension for Putin?
In light of the 180-degree turn that President Trump has made in these negotiations, I think it's a very significant thing, and especially if the president is ready to send things like Tomahawk missiles that have a considerably longer range than the ATACMS missiles that we have shared, but with limits to their use to our friends in Ukraine. So this is, the fact that it would go after energy infrastructure. I mean, there is at one level, it's a little problematic at one sense because that means civilian infrastructure too. But the problem is that Putin has been conducting what has to be called, and we should start calling it, a terrorist war. I mean, he has been not only kidnapping the thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children and Russifying them and so on, but he has been attacking civilians and attacking civilian infrastructure. And he is not being called, maybe some people are talking about some war crimes, but the language to anathematize him as effectively as a terrorist has been missing from all of this. And one of my problems here is that we have a very materialistic foreign policy culture in Washington. If it isn't guns and money or the diplomacy concerning guns and money, it's just not strategically important in Washington. And yet there are non-kinetic, non-material instruments of conflict which can be and should be exercised. So, for example, there is rhetoric, okay? And telling the truth about Russia and its activities is one of the most powerful things that can be done. This is what Ronald Reagan did. And when you tell the truth, you build a pro-defense consensus domestically, but you also help build a consensus internationally in favor of the victim as opposed to the aggressor. And this involves the use of rhetoric and semantics. The Russians have used, semantic warfare against us for forever. And the Chinese do this. The communist Chinese do this against us. These are standard totalitarian tactics, and so telling the truth and proper semantics is just the beginning of what we can call political warfare. And there are many different aspects to this. It means anathematizing the aggressor, isolating him from his population support base insofar as it exists, isolating him from his recruitment base, exacerbating splits within the leadership group, the oligarchs, and so on. It also involves offensive counterintelligence operations that are designed to effectively distort Russian intelligence and its proper assessments, either about Ukrainian or American purposes and capabilities. And then, of course, there's ideological warfare and so much else. And telling the truth about the history. I mean, in 2021, was it Putin wrote that notorious article about how Ukraine was never really a country and they're just part of a province of Russia, and all sorts of innocents in our country, and people who are not so innocent repeat these lies.
Right. It was a masterclass in propaganda in so many ways.
Yes.
John, I want to ask you about how you started off that answer. You said that the Trump administration had made a 180-degree turn. And I wanted to get your reaction to this quote. And this is from Whitney Tilson. He's a Democrat, but a Ukrainian activist and supporter. He says, quote, today, he said, it's amazing how quickly things have turned around for Ukraine. It was only 6 weeks ago that Russian forces had broken through in the Rabbit Ears offensive, and Trump was selling out Ukraine in Alaska. Since then, Ukraine forces have destroyed the breakthrough and are successfully counterattacking in many places. Trump has done a 180. The Flamingo missile is under production, and Ukraine is decimating Russia's energy industry. Slava Ukraini. So here is a Democrat activist saying, he sees maybe the same thing with the language you used. I would guess that you consider yourself a strong conservative, but you're maybe seeing the world and how this is played out in the same way. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it is. I think that characterization is exactly right. And I think that the president, who had gone into these negotiations with a certain, if I may gently call it, naive idealism about the possibility of reaching an agreement with somebody who was hell-bent on continuing this, mad aggression, he's finally got a bite of a reality sandwich. Putin spat in his face in Alaska. He spat in his face. And I think it has dawned on the president that that's what Putin has done, in spite of all of his warm and fuzzy, putting his arm around Putin and the red carpet and the nice, all of this stuff, which is designed to deal with the symptoms of tension rather than the causes of tension. And this is a generic problem of American diplomacy. And, one of the things that we teach at IWP is, we stress the importance of looking at the world the way it really is, rather than the way the propagandists would have you see it, rather than through the mirror images that you perceive, where you look at others as if they're just like you, rather than the way you wish the world to be, which is a little bit of what, I think President Trump has suffered. That he has been under the illusion that that Putin is capable of making a deal and living by it. But of course, Putin is part of a whole tradition of strategic deception in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia, violating all the agreements that they signed. How can you trust somebody who violated the Budapest Memorandum, for goodness sake? This is so, it has dawned on him that this is the way it is. And, there are some people around the administration and some people in the, they call themselves the restraint school. And these are people who seem to be born only after the Iraq War, and they think that history began with the Iraq War. I happen to oppose completely, a year before it happened, our intervention and nation-building effort in Iraq. But I believe that the restraint school has some valuable lessons to teach But the problem is that most of the people who identify themselves as ideological restrainers are people who downplay any threat that comes from any place, because they think if we start saying there's a threat from China or a threat from Russia, that we're going to have a big military buildup. We're going to get powerful, and when we get too powerful, we get arrogant, and then we start invading everywhere promiscuously. Well, I'm sorry. The restraint school has become an ideology rather than a valuable lesson that should be incorporated into sound prudential judgment.
Right. John, related to that restraint school, I think right now that they're waking up with a little bit of a headache because of what President Trump recently said that I'd like to get your reaction to. He said, quote, "Ukraine with NATO weapons could take back all of their land," end quote. This seemed to definitely represent a new rhetorical phase of diplomacy for him as part of maybe that 180. Is it anything more than rhetoric, or now the talk of intelligence sharing and Tomahawk missiles that to you is definitely a significant moment?
I think that the president's speculation that Ukraine could conceivably take back its land is not entirely unrealistic. And the reason I think that it would be a very difficult thing to do because of the degree to which the Russians erected those extraordinary defenses once they had reached a certain significant advance into Ukrainian territory. But let's just remember that the number 3 army in the world is effectively stuck in what is now basically a stalemate with the number 23 army in the world. And when you stop and think about that and what the number 23 army in the world has been able to do to the number 3 one, which has to depend upon North Koreans and the people from the individual national groups around the Russian Empire. He doesn't want to send his Slavic Russians into this war. He's going to send Kalmyks and Tartars and anybody else he can get a hold of. And by the way, we should be communicating with those captive nations inside the Russian Empire, and we should be letting them know the facts about how their sons are being slaughtered in a war that has nothing to do with them. And that maybe they should try to become like the Chechens, only you have, 10 Chechnyas around the Russian Empire, and Putin's going to have a big problem on his hands. And maybe even the Chinese in eastern Siberia can have their own referendum, like the one in Crimea. Wouldn't that be poetic justice?
Well, he is having major problems with his energy supply. As of today's recording, 37% of his energy facilities aren't producing what they should be, and that's going to cause some economic hardships for sure that are only going to be exacerbated. So maybe if you wanted to comment on the economics of this war for Putin and what that means long term if we're able to pinch off that energy supply.
Well, I could imagine long-range weapons causing serious damage to pipelines that go to China and to the whatever the methods are of getting the energy into India, for example. I think we have to be very careful about slapping India, particularly with high tariffs, because India is and ought to be a good friend of ours. And during the Cold War, it was not an accident, as they say in Moscow, that the Soviets put more investment in anti-American propaganda in India than in any other place in the world. And the reason for that was to try to split the world's oldest democracy, us, from the world's biggest democracy, India, both of which have a common British colonial background. So there were And so, we should be natural friends with India, and even more so today, given India's conflict effectively with China and the fact that China is occupying some of Indian territory. there are these tensions, and they've even gone to fisticuffs within recent memory. So, but if we can somehow choke off those energy deliveries that go to the main funders of all of this, it would be a huge thing.
So we've talked a lot about President Trump. Let me pivot and ask you about the Senate. If you could take those 100 senators and put them into your class, your program, what might you tell them with regards to the sanctions legislation that's sitting there right now? It looks like it's got 85 co-sponsors, but they're just sitting there still. When they get the chance to deal with that, what would you say to those 100 senators?
I feel ambivalent about sanctions, and particularly the secondary sanctions on friends of the United States. If that's what it takes, then that's got to be the last resort, it seems to me. I would much prefer to be bruising the Russian aggressors with long-range missile strikes, deprivation of their energy supplies, and so on and so forth. But to be harming our allies and harming other friendly countries that may not be directly allies, but friendly countries like India, is a very problematic thing. And so this is why I stress the problem of information warfare, political warfare, ideological warfare, and psychological warfare. We don't do any of those things. And those were decisive instruments of American national power during the Cold War, which were used at a crescendo by President Reagan. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example, called the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty the most powerful weapons we possessed in the Cold War. The most powerful weapons. How come they're powerful today too? So, and we're talking not simply about shortwave broadcasting, although when, the Bush administration and the Obama administration shut down all of these language services over VOA and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, RFERL, including Russian to Russia, and Ukrainian to Ukraine, and so many of the other languages in the surrounding countries. Now, this gave Putin an open field to run for a touchdown in brainwashing his own public. And so you have the spectacle. I've recently written an op-ed about this, which I'm hoping to publish, that somebody will publish it. But you have Russians, ethnic and linguistic Russians, living in the eastern Ukrainian provinces who have witnessed the crimes that Putin and company were committing against civilians and civilian infrastructure, not to mention the kidnappings. And they call their own relatives in Russia proper to tell them and to bear witness to these crimes. And their own relatives in Russia don't believe them because they've been so effectively brainwashed by Putin's domestic propaganda. Well, if there was a competing source of information, but the people over at the VOA and so on and so forth were saying, oh, nobody listens to shortwave anymore. Well, during crises, they will pull out their shortwave radio and listen to it. And that is one way that gets through. The internet can be blocked. Only some people, young people, very very skillful with their computers, can get virtual private networks. But the entire older generation knows nothing about this, depends entirely on Russian television. We need to be using information to get in there, to tell the truth. And then there are so many other, I made the list of different kinds of things that can be done in political warfare, and we're not doing them. And those things, Putin is probably more afraid of his own people than many in the West realize. And he has an internal security problem, which is why he has this pervasive FSB presence and the punishment of anybody who doesn't go along with his agenda. We need to exploit his internal security problem, and we're not doing it. I'd much rather do that and stick it to those monsters rather than to harm our allies with the kind of sanctions that they're talking about in the Senate.
Well, John Lenczowski, this has been a great conversation. You've pointed out some other tools in the toolbox we absolutely need to use. Before we close out, one last question. And if you had the chance to have President Zelensky in your classroom, maybe what might you tell him at this precise and delicate moment in his nation's history?
Well, I think that he has a pretty big bully pulpit himself. I think that they need to work on information warfare a lot more than they are, and they need to work on psychological warfare against the aggressor troops. These people have no serious motivation to fight. The Ukrainians have a motivation. The Russians and all of those minority groups whom Putin has harnessed, they don't have any motivation to fight. And so they are an incredibly vulnerable target in psychological warfare. But unfortunately, this is one of these arts that non-totalitarian countries ignore. And being good at psychological warfare is not your ticket to becoming a general in America's Department of War. That's not how you get there. And yet, and the way we conduct psyops, we don't use the full capabilities that we have. What psyops we do perform are done on a very tactical basis, dropping leaflets over heavy enemy troop concentrations, either to demoralize them or to teach them how to surrender or something like that. And, it's all very tactical. But strategic psychological operations involve changing the psychology of the entire population so that they can rise up and overthrow the regime. That's what happened with the Solidarity movement in Poland. That's what happened in the Baltic states. It spread like wildfire. How could 1 million people take to the streets of Moscow? We did lots of material things to pressure the old Soviet Union. We had the Strategic Defense Initiative. We had our military buildup. We deprived them of hard currency earnings. We restricted our technology transfers to them. There were all of these material pressures. We pressured them in Afghanistan. We showed, and then you had people like the Solidarity people in Poland who were stealing Soviet arms from the Soviet munitions depots in Poland and sending them to Nicaragua, to the anti-communist resistance, because they knew that if those people in Nicaragua could overthrow their communist masters without the U.S. Marine Corps, that resistance was actually possible. But these totalitarian and quasi-totalitarian regimes, they just want the people to be in this state of futile resignation. Resistance is futile, and life is hopeless. We have to accept our fate, and we're atomized. We're separated from one another by the internal security police, and so on. And so, keeping the population in a deep blue funk is exactly where the totalitarians want them. And by connecting with them, by communicating with them, by bearing moral witness to their sufferings and their human rights violations, all of these kinds of things, by informing them, by giving them the truth. The truth is the most powerful weapon, and we don't use it. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yes. Well, Thank you, John. I heard some of those same stories when I was in Gdansk, Poland this summer. Thank you for reminding our audience of those lessons. This is just the tip of the iceberg to the kind of information you're going to get from the Institute for World Politics. Please check them out at iwp.edu. And John Lenczowski, thank you so much for this brief conversation. May it not be but the first of many to come.
Thank you, Gary. I'm delighted to be with you. I think that you had raised some great issues, and keep up your great work. I appreciate it a lot.
All right. Thank you all for joining again another episode of Peace and Power Ukraine. We'll look forward to seeing you the next time. God bless.